Introduce the panelists and the discussions for today. Please give them a very huge round of applause for this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremony. As your moderator, I just wanted to again thank the Center for Sustainable Futures, and on behalf of the organizing partners who are behind this series of guest lectures that we've started off with one yesterday, and this is our second series where we're convening not only Pacific society actors, members of religious and faith-based organizations, other NGO colleagues, but also our indigenous leaders and practitioners, knowledge holders, who are also present with us in the room. Just want to acknowledge all protocols observed, whoever's joining us from the diplomatic corps, but also members who are currently convening at the Pacific Island Forum Secretary to discuss this very contentious issue as to why we are convening here today, deep sea mining. We welcome colleagues online as well. Maybe to set the scene for this session, I just wanted to provide an overview before I introduce my esteemed panelist here. Drawing back over a decade ago, when the region first launched this regional framework through then SOPAC, what we know today as SPC, through the Geohazards Division, launched a regional framework on deep sea mining, where Pacific Island countries back then and throughout the years could adopt some form of legislation that informs national policies, national legislative or policies or constitutions within the region to have some form of policy back home within the national waters or national level. So that was in 2012. Over the years, the region has tried to convene, and when I say the region, these are political crop institutions or Pacific leaders, different groupings who have tried to convene the region to inform different forms of policy that would rather inform this new form of extractive industries within the region. For this part of the region, we're not, extractive industries is not something new. This region has gone through several forms of extractives, has gone through several forms of testing, drawing back to our nuclear history in the Pacific. So these forms have not been anything new for us. But this is quite concerning because it's something that many of our leaders have attested to, many of our academic institutions, but as Pacific people, this is very dear when it concerns something we call home, which is our ocean. So today's Talanoa brings the perspectives of not only Pacific civil society, but other actors, national, regional, but also projecting what is happening at the International Seabed Authority or the international sphere. For us, as those who are calling for caution, raising awareness and doing advocacy around the need for more conversations, more science, more talks before anyone can proceed, it's quite concerning that this continues to progress at the international sphere, the International Seabed Authority, but also for us in the region, it is quite concerning where we have some pro players, our own Pacific states who are pushing the agenda. So it's a battle on two fronts, not only within the region, but within our national jurisdictions and at the International Seabed Authority, where this body meets, and I'm sure the panelists will speak more to it. With that, I'd like to introduce my esteemed panel here. Sitting at my far right, Langi Toribau, a consultant and advisor for Greenpeace Australia Pacific. Langi is no stranger to this place, or rather no stranger to this campus. A familiar face who has worked on environmental issues over the years, but who has extensive experience not only in the Pacific, but in Asia and the African continent. Joining Langi on this panel, we have Vani, who is with the Center Fiji Council of Social Services. She's the executive director. Again, Vani is no stranger to this place and this campus, bringing with her experience not only from the media, but the vulnerable communities that Vani works within in Fiji. Vinaka Vani. From Aotearoa, New Zealand, we are joined by Phil. Phil is from the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but coordinates specific partners. Phil has an extensive experience in campaigning on the issue of deep sea mining within the New Zealand waters, but has been also campaigning at the International Seabed Authority. Welcome to Fiji, Phil. Kia ora. And on my far left, we have Rufino, the executive director of PICAN, Pacific Islands Climate Action Network. Thank you very much, Rufino. Again, Rufino is no stranger to this campus, but within the civil society space. And he brings to the discussions the concerns around climate. But maybe to get things started, we should maybe draw the discussions back home. And I'm looking here at Vani before we can talk about the International Seabed Authority or where the region views the issue, or where we tap into the conversations around climate. It's better to start at home for us here in Fiji. And it's quite concerning where Fiji plays an important role, not only geographically as a hub of our region, but in terms of regional politics and the role that Fiji plays in how the region steps up, not only as a region, but how it presents itself internationally. Fiji has over the years has numerous positions on this very issue, deep sea mining. It has signed to several different sub-regional and international platforms around a need for caution, and more recently over the past 2 years, Vani, Fiji had signed a moratorium stance within its Melanesian brothers and sisters. But what is that concern when Fiji, as this regional key player, drives regional politics, drives regional solidarity, if I may stand corrected there, but what are the concerns for national communities and NGO partners in Fiji, where it projects being this champion globally, whereas back home, there are some serious concerns?
Rinaka, Joey, and apologies for arriving late. I might want to start by saying that FCOSS is a local NGO, and that's owned by 330 plus community-based organizations. Trust my phone to ring at this time. Just switch it off. 330 plus community-based organizations across Fiji, 10 national NGOs. And, you know, it was established by community leaders in the Western Division more than close to 7 decades ago. So, you know, our experience here in Fiji is that old, and we're a founding member as well of the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs. So you will understand why, you know, it is deeply committed to community-driven and sustainable development that upholds social, environmental, and indigenous rights. So I'd be stating the obvious that FCOSS strongly opposes deep sea bed mining due to its irreversible environmental damage, threats to community livelihoods, and of course a lack of regulatory safeguards. FCOSS members, you know, in the last 4 years, what's been central to some of the work that we've done is the concept of Sautu. It is an indigenous philosophy for prosperity and well-being. So to us, the ocean is not a resource for exploitation, but a lifeline for communities, a cultural heritage for indigenous peoples. And, you know, of late, because we are working in areas of climate change, including trying to relocate a village in the Northern Division, it is a global climate regulator. So our position is that the Fijian government must move beyond a temporary moratorium. I'll touch a little bit on that later on. But our position is that it must legally ban DSM outright to protect our environment, people, and future generations. I'm not sure if you've seen a copy of this, and it's available at the back. Thank you, Peng, for printing that. But this is a report that was commissioned by FCOSS and carried out by, or perhaps, done by Monash University. It's law clinic, climate justice clinic, and it, looked into a legislative. So it was a legislative and a policy review report. And what we found, despite years of global campaigns of moratorium led by our government, that there are no enforceable moratorium in Fiji. And if you read the report, you'll get the details. But we think that, as FCOSS, we think that there are legal and environmental imperatives for a ban, because despite all of the work that we have done for moratoriums, entering into partnerships with the MSG and our global advocacy around the ocean, those things are not enforceable locally. So despite government claims of a DSM moratorium, there is no legally binding prohibition, only a de facto ban due to the lack of regulatory frameworks, which we think that leaves Fiji vulnerable for future exploitation. We also think that existing laws allow DSM with minimal amendments, so that's high risk to me. The Mining Act, for example, 1965 could be easily modified to permit DSM, while the International Seabed Mineral Management Act already aligns Fiji with the international seabed mining regimes, making it crucial to legislate a permanent ban before corporate interests take hold. I might touch a little bit on the severe environmental and social risks. DSM, and I'm acknowledging that there are people in the room that already understand this, that DSM threatens marine biodiversity and, including fish stocks vital to Fiji's coastal and fishing communities, protected under the Fisheries Act. The Environmental Management Act mandates environmental safeguards, yet DSM's long-term impacts on ocean ecosystems remain unknown and potentially catastrophic. Indigenous rights over marine spaces are not adequately protected. And I know that there was a panel yesterday that discussed this. And this is despite provisions in the Itauke Affairs Act and the Itauke Lands Act. So perhaps I'll go into a call to action. And first is to government, that we must move towards a legal and policy shift towards a ban. We need to enact a legally binding national ban on DSM through explicit amendments to the Mining Act of 1965 and the Marine Spaces Act 1977. I'm struggling to read my own typing. To withdraw Fiji from any international DSM arrangements that do not align with ocean protection and indigenous rights. And perhaps to strengthen marine conservation laws and promote sustainable blue economy alternatives. We've been talking about this for quite a while. We really need to match action with our rhetorics. Then secondly, the call is also to us as civil society organizations and to community leaders who are listening. We really need to mobilize against DSM and demand a national ban for us in Fiji to protect marine biodiversity and indigenous custodianship. If we have to, we need to use legal mechanisms under the Itauke Affairs Act to challenge any attempts to approve DSM in Fijian waters. This is a big responsibility to those who have some mandate under that act. Amplify community voices in policy discussions to ensure that traditional resource guardianship is upheld. And I think this is an ongoing concern because so often we have policy discussions in Suva, in hotels that community leaders don't have access to. And the language we use in these policy forums completely alienate resource owners from important decisions. And then the last call perhaps is to the private sector and international partners. We need to support investments in sustainable ocean-based industries instead of destructive, extractive industries. We also need to hold international bodies accountable for ethical and environmental responsibilities, ensuring that Fiji is not pressured into DSM for economic gains at the expense of our people and our environment. And then perhaps the closing message is to say that we're saying, FCOSS is saying no DSM now or ever. It's a threat to our oceans, our communities, and our future. It's not a sustainable solution. A moratorium is not enough. Fiji must lead the Pacific by enacting a total ban on DSM. FCOSS stands in solidarity with communities, indigenous leaders, and environmental defenders in rejecting DSM and calling for legislative action to permanently protect Fiji's ocean territories. Naka.
Vinaka, Vani, and just you sharing the collective concerns that FCOSS and its partners are quite concerned about, and the need to do a lot of backyard cleaning, sorting out, keeping your house in order before we project anywhere, but also having this independent report that you've just launched. Congratulations, and I'm sure everyone is privileged to a copy when you do leave. But it is really trying to sort out and understand opportunities where Fiji can safeguard its national jurisdiction and its people, highlighting a number of issues, the need to probably consult not only within the government sphere, but it's the extended community and resource owners, as you rightfully highlighted. And I think it's a projection of just how vast and who the oceans impact. It's not just the economics, it's not just the political leaders, but the ocean impacts the vast population. Thus, there needs to be a wider and thorough consultation, and noting the call for action that FCOSS as a national civil society pushing and taking the government to task. Not a moratorium, but a ban. Maybe we'll draw to the region now, and it's quite concerning, and as national partners, and this is quite common, not only in Fiji, but there are concerns from national partners, the need to understand more, the need for more science, but the need for more conversations of such, not only from stakeholders, but one that provides both sides of the coin, from government to communities and other key stakeholders. But at the regional specs, it's now, Langi, you work in this space, and not only regional to international, but these discussions are starting to show up, and more frequently, and now we're seeing the Forum Secretariat convening its first ever high-level leaders dialogue. What are some of the concerns as a regional advocate who works in the ocean space, but within the ocean governance space, and how this issue of deep sea mining is showing up in the region?
Thank you, Joey, and Bolo Vinaka, and a good afternoon to you all. Vinaka Wale Vani, thank you for grounding us before we zoom up to the region. I'm a consultant now, and I'm doing this work for Greenpeace. I've been away from the region for about a decade through my interest to understand how foreign power, how their system works, and how their mindset drives some of the challenges we're facing in our part of the world. So I'm back with a very committed heart that I want to stop this, because I fundamentally believe that we can. This is one of those things that we can't treat it the same way that we've responded to pressure that has been led from the outside. This is one of those things that we have to put our foot down on. And I'm very happy that our local partners with FCOSS and the movement are setting the bar high, because I think that is what is required at this moment in time. For Greenpeace as an organization, their policy is very clear. There is no such thing as sustainable mining, period, land or sea. And that's as simple as sort of the narrative that we need to remove from the complexity that we normally get dragged into in this discussion. So what I will probably unpack a bit is this complexity that sometimes makes us feel divorced from the issue, or it makes us feel it's too far away, or it's too complex, it's too technical. And that is a design of the system. And that is a design of the system. So there is what the region is facing at this moment in time is two chambers of thinking. There are political voices that wants this to be driven as a political decision, and there is a technical component to it. The other chamber is the science, the lack of knowledge, the data, the history of what has taught us, and how do we apply some of this. And this complexity is sort of part of this journey that the region has gone through, is now embarking on, but they're starting on the wrong footing because of the political dynamics that is at play. So that's I think the kind of sphere in which deep sea mining sits at the regional level. There are a couple of different ways in how we can unpack what is the drivers of deep sea mining, what are the interests, what are the proponents, what are the impacts, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll name a few of this. It might be that I might confuse you more for walking in here, but I promise I'll try and get us to a point where I can simplify this to a way that we feel like we can control certain parts of this. That is our story to tell. It is not foreign partners to tell. It is not for the mining industry to tell. And certainly, it is not legitimate for governments alone to assume that they can do this for us. So that's going to be my spiel. So go along with me, I hope, on this ride. So my invitation is this issue of deep sea mining has unearthed a lot of intersections. There are a lot of nexus. There are a lot of trauma. There are a lot of false narrative and false projection. One chamber in where this is being discussed is climate, the climate narrative. So glad that our colleague Rufino is here, that will talk a bit more about that. And what we've been told is this is necessary for the green transition because of climate. And we've taken that and said we will help solve this problem without even questioning whose narrative is this. This is not our narrative. This need for green transition and the dependency on minerals, that is not a Pacific narrative. We should not even entertain it. That is another narrative there are responses to that are far more technical and with the climate team, but we can easily get dragged into that and have endless meetings about it. But as a Pacific response, it's quite simple. And we feel like there's a guilty consciousness that comes with it, that we feel like we have to be able to engage in it. So that's one of the chambers in which this intersection comes up. This triggers a lot of legacy issues. I think Joey touched on a few of this, where some of the trauma or some of the experiences from the region. We've gone through our nuclear testing days, the mining in Nauru, in Banaba. We have our fisheries experiences, forestry. There is a lot of legacy issues that we need to stop and just learn from, pull from those learnings and say, is this showing up in the same fashion, but just a different dress code? Is it the same players? Is it the same rhetoric? Is it the same approaches that they're taking in order to make an informed decision around? And I think a lot of this needs to come from a place of reflection so that we are not easily convinced that this is going to be the savior of our economic development, sustainable development in the region. The other is on ocean. So this is central in what we've highlighted as our lifeline in the Pacific, something that connects us. This is sacred to us, but it is couched as within this complexity is the high seas, the EEZ, and what is happening in your coastal waters. And they are deliberately running the narrative to make you feel like, even if you are a coastal community, that this is too far away for you. Don't worry about it. This will not infringe in your national jurisdiction, or no one should tell you what to do inside your national jurisdiction. This is about the high seas. Our responses as the Pacific should be that we view the ocean as one. That is a construct that works in favor of the industry and those that are in power. So we need to be deliberate around how we respond to this layer of complexity. The legality around this, some of the policy, human rights impacts. So the deep sea mining is now showing up in so many places, and it is hard to keep track of. And this is why the role of civil society is important, because sectorally, you can get lost in the discussion when you go into silos. I'm glad that within the construct of this panel, that we are able to see the bigger picture. We can read the rule book, the game plan for the industry, in how they're creating confusion deliberately in order to get their interest in. So that's the, just in a very short form, the key elements or the complexity and how DSM is showing up in the Pacific. Now, to address some of the questions that, the question that Joe had asked, and in particular, the meeting that's happening right now, this week in Fiji, is a response. And on one side, we were quite happy as civil society that finally the Pacific were coming together, the leaders mandated a dialogue to happen. But they started on the wrong foot by not allowing CSOs in the room. So of course we make noises, and of course we say that doesn't stop us from doing our own events and to talk about this issue. This is not for governments only to decide. This is so big and so fundamental that it requires a Pacific response. And there are some of the specific responses. It's easy to go straight into a moratorium, a ban, or we allow it, right? Like as a policy response, it's easy to go there. But that's a political decision. It's policy driven. But there is still some groundwork that needs to be done in order for us to ground truth, face the industry on their arguments, debate with proponents of this to be able to assess the validity of their arguments. We've done a number of different scenarios. I've played this a million times in my mind. I've discussed this with a lot of players on both sides of the chambers. There is no argument that is sound that gives the justification for this industry to move forward. And some things that I think is a minimal response that we could do is, one, say back to the mining industry, our governments, this false climate narrative on the dependency of minerals for the just transition is not ours to be responsible for. That is not a Pacific narrative. That in itself is it's a strong signal. It doesn't mean that we're not doing our own work on the just transition. It's just this part is not ours. The response is circular economy. You cut down on your consumption, or your, like, it's a bigger conversation that is happening elsewhere. The second is, by virtue of the political influences of the industry on our countries like Nauru, Cook Islands, for instance, our story is now narrated by the mining industry. The Pacific story, your story, my story, our story is now being told by the mining industry. We have to resist that. No matter how the complexity is around this is our sovereign right, we have signed up agreements with this company to come and operate legally in our country. That does not give them the right to tell our story on our behalf. We have to resist that. The third is on some of these pertinent things that are important to us. For instance, the tuna fishing industry. They are not on the table, they're not at the table right now. That is an economic driver for most of our governments. It's a dependency on livelihood as well, similar to our coastal communities. We need to be able to say, do an impact study. We need to make sure that that baseline work is also done. And that can contribute to the urgency on needing on science. There is one of the other arguments that's coming in is the need for science and research, absolutely. But this can't be done for science, for exploitation. I had goosebumps at a meeting in Tahiti, in fact, in December, where our brothers and sisters from Wallis and Futuna, our indigenous leaders, said that one of their customary practices is they do science to protect. It's so simple, but it completely, it reimagines the way how we talk about science. We don't normally question ourselves with, we just go and do the technical science and the work on research. But do we even ask if this is legitimizing exploitation? Is it giving grounds for a wrong pathway? And I would really love to reimagine how we talk about science and research in this, because there are indigenous knowledge. There are indigenous and customary practices from the panel that was held by our leaders that are also in the room here yesterday, prove that. So maybe the conversation is around coexistence of these two types of approaches, rather than it's either or. Maybe, but we need to move the conversation beyond the blaming of whose approach is right. We need to move beyond that. And that signal does reorient the kind of conversation that we are having. It does allow us to come back onto the mat, to come back onto the table, to redesign the way in how we're thinking. I have other things, but I'm probably going to stop there because it might be that I'll end up taking up time. Thank you.
Thank you, Langi, and thank you for really, giving an overview of where this issue is popping up in different spaces within the region, but also really challenging the narratives. Who does it stand to benefit and who is driving this narrative? And as specific people, the challenges for us is what are the narratives we need to drive as specific people to safeguard not only our environment, but also our islands and people. So thank you so much for bringing that to the mat, but also acknowledging that knowledge sits in different places. It is not just the formal institutions of just governments, scientific institutions, but within our indigenous communities. And how do we use these different forms of knowledge to inform policies and ways forward? But also a caution that the region needs to get it right. It's like we taking just snippets and band-aids approaches to say, let's just meet for the sake of meeting. And again, really questioning who's convening these spaces. I will maybe come back to the fisheries, and I know you want to share more about the fisheries, but we'll go to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to our colleague and our brother, Phil, who's been around the activism back in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, since 2012 and mobilizing, because I think the case study for New Zealand and where it is right now is a really good example of where the International Seabed Authority is at. So maybe before you could give us a projection of the importance and why Pacific governments need to be cautioned and about the activities and how things are playing out at the International Seabed Authority, I think maybe just share a little bit about the experiences in Aotearoa, because it really relates to the current state of play of where the ISA is and who are the key players. Thank you, Phil.
Tēnaka, Joey. Firstly, thank you to the hosts here. It's a real privilege to be in this space. And thank you to Pang and organising partners. The hospitality has been touching this week and a great group of people to be spending time with. Thank you. And thank you all for turning up this evening. I don't want to hijack too much on this, but I think the New Zealand case study, I think we can call it, over the last 20 years could be helpful in relation to where we're at now on the journey that the Pacific as a region is traveling through and the world is traveling through. So I'll break this into chunks of time. And I'll preface this with, I am not a scientist, I am not a lawyer, I am a surfer, I'm a person that lives beside the sea, I play in the sea daily. When I got into this, I was literally accosted in my wetsuit saying, bro, it's happening, you gotta come and, jump in here. So going back to 2005, well, we'll go back before that actually. There are elements, resources, if that's the term, that exist at the seabed in various places, including Aotearoa, including many Pacific Islands, including international waters, that could potentially be turned into money. So personally, I can understand the interest around exploring that for economic purposes. That's sort of a bottom line. In 2005, New Zealand activated that under the government of Helen Clark. She opened New Zealand's EEZ to seabed mining exploration, and that immediately, one of the first exploration licenses was directly off my coast in Whangaroa, Raglan, on the west coast of the North Island, and the companies were required to consult with Mana Moana, the indigenous community that had customary authority over the area. And immediately the opposition, our local marae, the local hapu, the group of people that have existed there for a long period of time, immediately were not into this, and they brought it to the community. Community stood up, and the rest is history. So between 2005 and 2012, there were multiple exploration permits granted in New Zealand's EEZ. The entire west coast of the North Island, from just north of Wellington all the way up to Cape Reinga, out from shoreline out to 12 nautical miles, was in exploration licenses. There were big areas in the exclusive economic zone, in the Kermadec Trench, off the east coast of our island, and also in the Chatham Rise, which is a very productive fishery sector east of Christchurch on the South Island, heading out to the Chatham Islands. So that period was an active period for communities in opposing these multiple companies that were propping up, and that was, I can recall when my personal experience, when I first heard of this proposed idea of strip mining the seabed for materials, my head was spinning. I couldn't quite comprehend the notion. And I was living at the time in Taranaki, which is a beautiful region south of where I live now. And there's a beautiful maunga, a mountain. It looks like Mount Fuji, and it has hundreds of, I think 160 rivers that come down off the mountain. I was living on the banks of one of the most significant rivers, and the iron sand that exists along my coast, most of it traveled down the river that I was living on the banks of, and I was looking up at the mountain, which is sacred, and I was watching it go out to the shore, and the idea was I could understand the cultural offence that this could cause to our Indigenous people. So that's 2005 to 2012. In 2012, the John Key government implemented exclusive economic zone legislation, which enabled exploitation applications to come through the system. And between 2013, we received the first application, 2015 a second, and another in 2016. These were developed exploitation applications, not exploration. This period of time is when the EU SOPAC DSM program was going on in the Pacific. So there was sort of early considerations in the region, while in New Zealand we were maybe a decade ahead. Not a race we want to be winning, but anyway, So the first application was outright declined. It was in shallow waters, 20 to 40 meters, 20 kilometers offshore. These applications go through the Environmental Protection Authority, and our laws, while they were put in place to enable an industry that the government was really eager to establish, they were reasonable as far as participatory. We were able to submit in writing and also engage in the hearing processes. So there was up to 40 days of hearings, open hearings, and we could bring expert evidence in and challenge the company evidence. Anyway, the first one completely declined. Second one in the Chatham Rise declined outright as well. The third one, the key government tinkered with the legislation a little bit at the request of the industry. It had another go, and they were initially granted consent, but then it was overturned at the High Court, Court of Appeal, all the way to the Supreme Court. So at this point, and the Supreme Court sent it back in 2021, back to the EPA for reconsideration, and that happened last year. This time last year it began, but the company pulled out of the process. And in relation to Full Circle, the government recognises, and I submitted this to a select committee hearing where on the proposal from Debbie Ngāre Wapaka, the Te Pāti Māori leader, to ban seabed mining in New Zealand waters. I submitted that the only way that this activity could possibly get consented would be to completely change the law. Fast forward to 2024, 25, and the law has been completely changed. And there's a backdoor through a fast track process that puts economic development considerations ahead of environmental considerations. So that's where we're at the moment with the current government. So just want to wrap, and I'll just talk about a few characteristics of this process. So the one main characteristic is the opposition has been broad spectrum across society. It's been large, and it's been consistent and sustained over 20 years. The fishing industry, Langi mentioned, the fishing industry engaged in opposition to these proposals throughout since 2013, and they've spent millions of dollars defending their interests because they recognise the risk to fisheries of this proposed extractive activity. So yeah, I won't go into the impacts. I mean, I think we can generally move past the question around environmental appropriateness of the activity. It is not appropriate environmentally to do what is planned as it stands. That's a summary statement, and I'm happy to make it. Something that's characteristic both in New Zealand historically and in the ISA context, the company narrative is that these areas are deserts. They are not ecologically important. There's not much life there. It's been shown to be untrue in the New Zealand cases, and it is clearly untrue in the International Seabed Authority area, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is sitting there. We'll talk to this this image a bit later. I think just finally, the summary sort of observation of engaging in that domestic context is that governments underestimated a few things. One, they underestimated the connection to and the drive to protect the marine environment of human beings, and they underestimated the complexity of dropping a traditionally terrestrial activity into the dynamic marine environment. It is highly complex, and to me, the cases in New Zealand show that under law, this activity is actually illegal because it does not meet environmental criteria that the world has agreed to under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So I think I'm going to leave that there, but kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, Phil, for sharing the New Zealand experience. Because if you were to put, there's two cases here, and maybe it's important to also bring in the case of Papua New Guinea, who issued the world's first commercial seabed mining license in 2012. But the approaches taken from movements and activists and NGOs on ground are lessons that we could learn from, where you partners in Aotearoa are pushing the legal boundaries, challenging this industry, whereas 2012, and I'm looking in the room, it was a regional response where there was lack of consultation, agreements were signed, and companies were set to go into actual exploitation. But it is to give praise to movements on ground, people who constantly kept the government accountable in terms of petitions, in terms of going after the investors, but not only just within Papua New Guinea, because they had to look at the region. And this institution, USP, played a crucial role in drawing petitions to keep the Papua New Guinea government accountable. And they went after investors, and maybe we can give credit to movements who investors maybe lost interest in supporting Nautilus back then, but there were two different approaches that groups in Aotearoa and the case of Papua New Guinea and the region as to how they challenged these two different developments in Aotearoa and also in PNG. Thank you for sharing. Very quickly, considering time, I'll invite Rufino to share a little bit about some of the climate concerns. We have so much climate discussions in our region. There's a lot to talk about on climate, but what are the concerns for climate groups acknowledging the current state of our ocean's health and acknowledging the valuable role it plays as a climatic regulator? Having that in mind, we're in a triple climate planetary crisis right now. With this added concern around deep sea mining and its potential impact, not only on the oceans, but our way of life, what are some of the climate concerns from the climate groups?
So thank you so much, Joey. Bulavinaka, everyone. It's kind of slack being the last to talk because all the good material has been so well articulated and delivered by this amazing panel. Yeah, and we probably crunched for time. My watch is telling me to stand up. Yeah, so much pressure. I just want to start off by saying that I completely agree with what everyone has shared. You know, we have heard in depth that the issue of DSM, what the issue of DSM poses to our environment and to the Pacific as a whole. And I would say that anyone who tells you, particularly from industry, that you know that they can do this with little to no implications, negative implications on the deep ocean and the environment, I would say they don't know what they're talking about. You know, how can someone, especially from industry, confidently say that they can explore or mine without causing irreparable harm to the deep ocean when we, as scientists, know very little about this vast body of space and the biodiversity that lives there? As a scientist, as a marine ecotoxicologist, I can tell you that for a vulnerable region like ours, that is at the forefront of the triple planetary crisis, that is climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, deep sea mining will further exacerbate the crisis and create a shift in the nexus that will completely dilapidate the blue economy and the blue Pacific continent. And here's why. So last year, the World Economic Forum announced that we had crossed 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. I don't know how many of you are aware of this planetary boundary framework, but there are 9. And within these 9 boundaries, they are identified as like safe operating zones. So this is the level or space at which the planet can safely operate and regulate itself to remain stable and resilient. Now, by crossing these boundaries, it increases the risk of abrupt and irreversible environmental changes at continental and global scales. So this is not even national, this is continental and global scales. So imagine this. In 2009, we had crossed 3 of the 9 planetary boundaries. And it's not to say that we were doing kind of well. It was just because some of these other planetary boundaries were not really well understood or researched. So we could confidently say that at a global level, we had crossed 3 of these 9 planetary boundaries. Then as we got to, there's more research, more information, in 2015, we had realized that we have now crossed 4 of these 9 planetary boundaries. And one of these planetary boundaries that was unexplored, just to give an example, is around emerging pollutants and novel entities, right? So like plastics, right? They're emerging, some of them are novel to an extent, and we didn't really understand its real implications within this planetary boundary framework. But by 2022, when research had uncovered more of the findings of its implications, it had pushed other planetary boundaries even further away from the safe zone, and it had pushed one planetary boundary completely out of the safe zone. So then we had crossed 5 of the 9. The year after, we crossed 6. Just last year, we had crossed the 7th. So think about how scary that is, that every year since 2022, we've been crossing one planetary boundary. So this crisis, it's unfolding much faster than we really realize or anticipated. Now, if you still cannot understand how catastrophic this is, the IPCC and climate scientists around the world have made it very clear that if global temperatures were to surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Pacific Island region will be unable to handle the catastrophe that will follow, right? So during these UN meetings and during our regional meetings, we're always saying, we need to keep 1.5 alive, 1.5 alive. Now, global temperatures since last year have consistently remained above average global temperatures of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we are really in a state of urgency. And we all know that the ocean is the largest carbon sink, right? There's so many different carbon sinks around the world, our forests, like mangroves. So the ocean is the largest. Now, a report last year found that no trees and land globally had absorbed any CO2 in 2023. So this means that the ocean had to absorb much of this difference. So none of the forests, including the Amazon forest, absorbed a CO2 that would have made a difference. In fact, the Amazon forest turned from being a carbon sink to a carbon emitter because of much of the decaying forests. Now, when the ocean takes in more CO2, its chemistry is affected and it begins to warm, obviously. Now, for a long time, the DSM industry has been pushing the narrative that if they operate in the deeper parts of the ocean, all of that activity is kept isolated because of the pycnocline zone. For those of you who don't know what this pycnocline zone is, it's a layer within the ocean that is created, such as a barrier, when there is a rapid change in ocean temperature. So you have like the deep ocean, which is very cold, and then the upper layers, which is kind of warm. And then somewhere in between, when there's this rapid change in the temperature, the density difference creates this barrier. Okay, it's just explaining it very loosely. The purpose of the pycnocline zone is not to operate as a barrier to keep everything below the deep ocean within that area and to separate it from, the upper layer. That's not the purpose of the pycnocline zone, even though, industry narrative is explaining it that way. Anyway, when oceans warm, what happens to the changes in this density? The pycnocline zone would shift, right? It would shift upward. And in doing so, it would affect because the pycnocline zone is very important in ocean regulation, like deep ocean currents, nutrient cycle, all of these processes will be affected when the ocean gets more and more warm. And this is happening very rapidly. So this is to say that, like my fellow colleague said, nothing ever happens in isolation. Everything is interconnected. We know this from the planetary boundary framework. We know this from the way our oceans are regulated and how, nature as a whole regulates. It's all interconnected. So I would say, knowing this, is that for the Pacific, we will certainly see irreversible effects of DSM before you live through a time to enjoy and reap the economic benefits from mining activity. And I haven't even touched on the cultural aspects of it. There's so much to unpack. Because like I said, it's all interconnected. But for now, I'm going to stop there because it's a lot of information to kind of digest. And I'll hand it back to the moderator. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Vinaka.
Thank you, Rufino. And I think that was a really good projection of where the planet is and in this climate crisis and the timelines that we are living by. And to add another destructive industry to the equation, where are we headed not only as a global planet, but for us, especially in this part of the region where we are faced with the impacts of climate change. So I'll open this up now to the audience, and I welcome questions online. Thank you for those that are still joining us online, but I'll open it up if you have any questions to any of our panelists seeking further clarity. We'll open the floor up now. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. That was very insightful. It seems to me that there's already an alignment from government perspective to actively pursue deep sea mining, whereas there's a proposal to outright ban it, but there's an indication that the course is set, right? So what would it take, or what type of engagement or what type of pressure, political or civil society pressures, what actions are actually capable of turning that ship around and forcing them to prevent that?
Thank you for that question. I think just to caveat that there is only a few countries that have decided or made up their mind that they want to pursue deep sea mining activities. There's only a handful, so majority of the Pacific Island countries are still in consideration phase. So the response to what is required now, we probably need to simplify it rather than trying to have an answer to it. Because the first step that we're seeing in what they've bypassed is consultation, meaningful consultation. Step one, for Nauru, Cook Islands, and some of our other countries in the Pacific that have an interest in pursuing this, they already made the assumption that this is an industry worth investing and exploring. That is a big decision that requires legitimacy from your people. That's what we are asking for. And then they've gone ahead and signed deals and put calls out for interest to be expressed in. So by the time we are engaging at that point, we're just putting a Band-Aid solution because the bigger decision has been made. We're then talking to regulators. We're then talking to policymakers who are just operationalizing a political decision. What we're saying is you need to pull this back because we need the basics. We need the legitimacy, the proper engagement, consultation with your people, with indigenous knowledge holders, with communities, affected communities, with civil societies, whether or not this is worthy. And I think from what has been shared by the panel is we have too many other priorities we need to focus on in the Pacific. This is a distraction. Simple. So yeah, I might leave it at that if that does.
Yeah, maybe at the local level, I've talked about a few things that government can do, and that's really legal reforms. But government won't do it unless communities call for it, and that's really important. And here's the little light at the end of the tunnel is that there's been some reforms lately with the Fijian government. There's been reforms in the public finance sector, rural development, Fijian affairs. There's been a lot of internal reviews that's been ongoing. And next year is elections. And it's the perfect time for people to mobilize. GCC has just been set up. That's the Great Council of Chiefs. They have a role. So we've got to tell them that they need to stop any suggestions for DSM. It's clear the position should be no DSM, no moratorium. It's a complete ban we want. And I think the GCC being established can be a blessing in disguise because we've got to use that mechanism to stop any suggestions for DSM in Fiji waters.
Thank you, Rulangi, for really emphasizing that it is a distraction to the region. We are compounded with so many priorities: the health, education, climate, the financing of our large ocean states. Yet this is turning up to be another somewhat priority for our region, and it is turning out to be a distraction. And thank you, Vani, for really highlighting the national processes that we as non-state actors have to have our formal institutions held accountable. I'll entertain more questions if we have any questions on the floor. And maybe whilst we are waiting for questions, I'll maybe just look at Phil and maybe ask you to just state where we are. Do we have a question online? Whilst we have someone draw from I'll just ask Phil to maybe give us a current state of play at the International Seabed Authority. As our region convenes this space to discuss a regional approach to this concern, we also have to know that our Pacific Island countries are state members or members to the International Seabed Authority. And what is the current state of play?
Thank you, Joey. We do have a map of the Clarion-Clipperton zone, and maybe we could potentially put the map up on here for reference. So just, do you want me to give a brief overview of the ISA and what it is? So the International Seabed Authority is a UN mandated organization. The Secretariat is based in Kingston, Jamaica. It's made up of 170 members, country members that have signed on to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The ISA has already granted 31 exploration permits so this is exploration, not exploitation permits for deep sea mining in international waters. So the ISA has mandate to manage activities in international waters, so beyond countries' jurisdictions, and that area covers roughly half the surface of the planet. So it's got a big mandate. they've issued 31 exploration permits. Of those 31, there are 17 in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is a large area between situated between the EEZ of Hawaii and Mexico and Kiribati to the south. There might be a map coming up, but it's massive. It's continental in scale. It's 4,500 kilometers from east to west. That's similar to California to New York. There's 17 in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, and then there's another 5 in the Pacific, and that's in the northwestern Pacific. So the world's eyes are on the Pacific in this activity. And there we go. So you can see the exclusive economic zone of Hawaii on the left there, Kiribati on the bottom left, and Mexico on the right there. Each of these describe the contract holders, and they're held by some of the largest countries in the world. Russia, China, India, Korea, and UK, France, Germany, and 4 Pacific Island countries. So Nauru holds a license, Tonga, Kiribati, and Cook Islands hold exploration licenses there. So the exploitation regulations are currently being negotiated at the International Seabed Authority, and that's an ongoing process. In 2021, during the COVID-19 global pandemic, Nauru pressed a legal hot button provision called the 2-year rule, which basically implored all of the other members of the ISA to put in place the rules and regulations for exploitation. Otherwise, they have the right to submit an application even without rules and regulations in place. That triggered that was a big wake-up call to the entire world. It was a real it was a controversial thing to do, and it triggered 2 years of accelerated effort to work on the regulations by the world. There was typically the countries meet twice a year at the ISA in Kingston. For 2 years, they met three times. And talking about a distraction, countries had to take focus off other priority issues to attend to this matter. So that happened in 2021. The time period passed, and where we are today is Nauru has indicated in November last year that their mining company intends to submit its exploitation application in June 2025. So the world and the region will need to consider that. And there's no way, the regulations are a long way away from being finished, minimum 3 to 5 years. So that's the thing. One thing I want to say is Nauru's company walking through these, there's some staged, I guess you could call them, no return gateways. If they pass these gateways, you can't bring them back on the safe side of that gateway. So there's a staged process over the next, I'd say 6 months to a year that the world will need to respond to appropriately. Otherwise, this activity will kick off in the very near future. And attached, it's a little bit like there's this Trojan horse going through, and then the world is attached. They're on the trailer behind this action. So it's not just one operator, it's the world arriving with it and setting up shop in that area there for decades to come. That'll do.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks for giving us the overview and the current state of where the International Seabed Authority is at, but who are the key pushers behind where the current conversations are happening at this international sphere, noting that there is also a growing number of like-minded states who are calling for the need to have an open discussion at this international forum around the need for precaution or somewhat moratorium. I see a question, and I'll hand it over to Liza to pose the question to the panel.
Yeah, so just a question online from Patterson. Should we be concerned about deep sea mining used for national security in militarization?
I also just want to acknowledge the room. If there are any geopolitical experts in the room that want to address this, but we do have a response to this. So I just want to just acknowledge there's a lot of expertise that also sits in the room. If you want to contribute to the responding to this question. So the short answer is yes, but it's not just on national security. It's global in nature. There is no hiding around the dependency on minerals on the production of military equipment. This has been from the get-go when they were negotiating UNCLOS, when the implementing agreement was then put in place before the International Seabed Authority kicked in. So this interest has always been known. It just hasn't shown itself here, but we will see it shortly. With what is happening with the Trump administration, with China's increasing influence in the Pacific, with the disparity around some of our political institutions and infrastructures in the region, we will start to see those that are really behind the scene in running our political infrastructures. It's probably as blunt, but probably broad that I can respond to it. But this does go back to this chambers of where decisions have been made. The political chamber, this is one of these things that we don't see. Our politicians are making decisions on some of these drivers, the false economic argument, the false narrative argument, and this military drivers. Yeah, and that's one of those areas we need to unearth, and that's where consultation is important. We need them to tell us, who are you listening to? What interest are we responding to? If this doesn't serve us, we have a right to say no to it. And what we have been shepherded into is the technical discussion on deep sea mining. So don't be too distracted only. It's important to engage in the technical part of deep sea mining, but the vacuum, the dark area, the evil part, okay, I'll see it, I'm an activist. The evil part is where a lot of this policy and political unknown is. And it's scary because it determines your future, our future and our fate.
Maybe I'll add to that and say yes, definitely at the national level. I know that Langi alluded to the, global security and militarization. I can say, as a national NGO, that this can also occur if it hasn't already been attempted in the past. I can say at least once in the last, few years, you could see something like that happening. So part of why this is being released now is to coincide with our Prime Minister being in a conference in Europe, right? And we've got to be really, sometimes being preemptive is not a bad thing for us as communities, as civil society, because we also have to be looking at ways in which our government is entering into development cooperation, arrangements and partnerships. I know that late last year, there was a foreign policy white paper that was passed. I don't recall being asked to contribute to it as a civil society organization. I don't recall any public consultations around that. I know it shouldn't alarm me, but it alarms me that there are people with military backgrounds that are in charge of these various policy documents. And so I think the responsibility for us as citizens to be watching very closely what our government is doing is now more important. If we didn't do it in the last 5 years, we have to do it now and going forward. Just as we cast our vote for election and to elect our representatives in parliament, we should continue that responsibility in scrutinizing all of what they do, not only in policy spaces, but also how they use our funds. Like we've sent our politicians to MSG meetings to enter into these agreements on moratorium only to find out that it's not legally binding. So how much did we use, contributing to these discussions at the regional level? Are we getting our money's worth? Are we getting the protection and the security that we need? That's the question I have to pose to citizens, particularly if you live around the coastal areas. If you're from Lawe and Moala and Lomaiviti, you should be very concerned.
Vinaka, Vani, and thank you, both of you and Langi, for bluntly naming, but also providing the broader context and the national context that this question impacts. I saw Ciel and Maureen had their hand up.
Good evening, everyone. Maybe just to the last question and the first question, because they, in some ways, are tied. The green lighting of DSM in the region started with two kind of propositions: win-win, win for environment and win for economy. And on that notion, all of our countries jumped. Because really, if you say it's a double win, of course. So my second point is that it was very clear that our countries have to do very little, except to say, actually, we'll make a lot of money out of it, and therefore, we will proceed. What they did was effectively shift the burden of proof to civil society, to our frontline communities, to prove why it is not a win-win. Very clearly, industry players had to walk backwards on nothing lives down there. I mean, you would be horrified in 2012 by the kinds of false information perpetuated by industry and our governments at that time. The more we proved that this was not the right option for our countries, we went from a triple win: win for the environment, win for economy, and win for the climate, which is where that comes in. We're now having to debunk. We know across all those three narratives, they are false and they don't work. And now we have to contend with security. This idea of critical minerals and the discourse in the development around critical for energy, whose energy, and now critical for security, whose security. So we find ourselves again as civil society having to prove again and again why this proposition is not for us in the Pacific. And yet we still get hammered. We get new. This is the new one. Critical defense, critical minerals for peace and security. We have to draw the line as civil society actors, that these kinds of narratives, I mean, it is outrageous what people claim, even our governments, to say to us, actually, we can still go ahead with all of this. I mean, the amount of information and knowledge, scientific and non-scientific, social, that exists right now, we really should have closed this. And this is why I agree with Vani. We need to move to an outright ban. I mean, this idea, we need more science. For what? What will more science tell you, except that it is irreversibly destructive? What is it going to do to our fisheries? We don't know. Our governments don't know. But there is enough information to push a ban position right now. And so I think we got to be careful about these kinds of imperatives that come at us. And although we accept the responsibilities of the kinds of due diligence that's necessary, actually industry players don't even have to defend the kinds of propositions that they make and they state. And they are sitting behind our governments and behind our government flags and speaking on all of our behalves, perpetuating lies and myths. The military defense one is just the latest to debunk. And all I can say about Trump is that he wants to halve the defense budget. Perhaps that is where we need to go.
Thank you, Maureen. Siale, you had a question or? And when you're speaking from the kingdom or as Siale?
Quick one, just, often it makes me wonder in terms of how we're promoting regionalism and I suppose that we are all here as citizens of the region. And then we only have like 4 countries. Tonga, kind of not too proud to be a Tongan right now. And the Cook Islands, Nauru, Kiribati. 4 out of how many countries in the Pacific? 30, maybe. And then we allow that to dictate where the deep sea mining going because of that sovereignty claim. And I'm just thinking, is there space for us to claim that there is a regional sovereignty represented by Pacific people that we need to tell those 4 countries, you are not the majority as we usually, claim that that's how we make decisions, consensus or majority. And so I'm just like throwing up there because sometimes it just like couldn't make sense because if you claim that you understand deep sea mining as our country usually say, then they just like refuse to do the right thing. Because if you hear everything that we have been hearing tonight, you're already convinced that this is a nowhere to go. But there must be something more that may not be related to science at all. Ego, maybe, or this kind of sovereignty rubbish that they are claiming that it's, yeah, thank you.
I think that's a really important point, Siale, and goes back to Langi's intervention around the different chambers and where this decision-making sits. There is a political pathway for it, and there is also the technical art. And I think for us as state non-state actors, but citizens of this Blue Pacific, we have a role to elevate that political will where our governments come to an agreement for the safeguarding of this region. We've done it for nuclear. I think we can do it for deep sea mining. I think there's a question, Hakon.
Right. Thank you so much for very interesting discussions and reflections. Simple question, maybe not so simple to answer, but I'm wondering how, if I can hear some reflections on how you think these types of dialogues can be sustained also sort of after this week of the deep sea Talanoa happening in PIF, because I think this is kind of a general pattern I also see back in Norway, where deep sea mining is also being pushed, is that there's a lot of public attention when there's something happening there's something's going to happen, and media is then sort of, they have their story to write about. But I'm wondering if there's a need for larger public engagement, how can this dialogue be sustained after this week as well? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. My response is that, we within the civil society space, we're constantly finding ways to coordinate with each other and work together to ensure that kind of sustainability. Next month, for example, PICAN will be hosting an open forum talking about just transition. And we're bringing in international partners to be part of that conversation as well, because it's so important. And these are some of the ways in which, we're working with each other to keep the momentum going, keep the conversation alive, and centering the message around what it is that we need to prioritize as a Pacific region. And just on that point, there was a few things that I wanted to cover, which relates to the previous conversations we were having in the room. One was on just transition. You know, for that particular question that was projected earlier, I think that, you know, the military is really the last of any kind of sector to talk about just transition. For one, it doesn't give any accountability to the amount of carbon emission that is released. So on all global reports, when you're looking at carbon emission, none of it from the military is accounted for in those reports. So we just don't know. And just on the point of just transition, it's this conversation, these false narratives, it's the same across different conventions, different UN entities. It is the same. For example, you know, we've been having this conversation within the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution, right? The same thing, where industry is saying, we need virgin plastics. We need it because it's important for, you know, medical devices and sanitary purposes, and for the Pacific Island countries and territories in particular, it's important for, you know, food safety, for clean water. We've heard all of that before. And we know that it's false because these materials that they're producing are highly toxic. We have safe and sustainable alternatives, which industries refuse to invest in because it's cheaper to produce virgin plastics than it is to you know, invest in like reuse, recycling, to create that true circular economy. Going back to DSM, same thing. Virgin metals and minerals, it's cheaper to extract and produce for newer products than it is to invest in research and development to ensure that we can use some of these existing metals that are already within in this economy, and transform it, right, to create a true circularity. It's all to do with profit. And for the Pacific, it's strange to see, well, not that question in particular, but we've already identified that the greatest security risk within the Pacific is climate change, right? We need to keep that central focus. We do not, just like how we do not produce plastics here, we do not produce any you know, innovative technologies that require virgin metals, and particularly for the military, we do not have state-of-the-art, you know, new generation kind of military equipment that requires for us to invest in DSM. Those are great for maybe for the richer global North countries, but for the Pacific, it's not relevant. And I think it's just another distraction that we need to pull away from. So, I mean, I'll stop there, but that's just my initial reaction to those questions. Thanks.
Considering time, I feel wanted to just respond to the question projected on the wall. Then we'll come back to
Ray, I
Vani.
came then. The thing is
And
still
then
empty.
if we could have very
Your
quickly,
dinner, please.
and I will take you as the last question, and then we will close. Let's just see how time goes. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Joey. Just really briefly on the question around security, around sovereignty, Ciale. The resources, again, I don't like using that word, but the targeted resource has been deemed by law to be the common heritage of humankind. Any exploitation of that resource must benefit humanity as a whole. So how does one country's security desires fit within that? And I'm not really the one to speak about this, but the 2050 strategy, the top line is a region of peace and security, I understand. So that's a question. So the common heritage is something there. And just on Halcon's input their action. I just want to underline the urgency of the situation. That big area of ocean is going without action, without conscious, deliberate action to stop it. It will occur in, if not in 1 or 2 years, in 3 or 5 years. So just underlining that call to action. Thank you.
Just a very quick answer. Partner with the Pringle Alliance.
Thank you, Vani. And it's a collective of regional NGOs, but also a PLUS membership that extends to national societies. Very quickly, we'll get Uncle Saul and you, and then the gentleman at the back. Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, we'll take the 3 questions.
So aloha kako. My name is Solomon Kaho'ohalahala, and I come from a small island, Lanai, in Hawaii. I'm trying to understand all of your presentations and what they mean for us who are just what we might call civil society. And we're just people from Oceania, okay? How's that? But Longa, you talk about the complexity of this issue of deep sea mining and that we need to really focus on what is more important rather than getting caught up in all of the different kinds of things at play related to deep sea mining. And then you just mentioned that why is this process relevant to our place, the Pacific? You know, it's a global north kind of thing. And I just learned that term. Global north means all the guys in Europe, and the global south is all the guys in the ocean, okay? So I want to at least put forth to you is that if you can put that slide back on the Clarion-Clipperton area, because part of my response is related to that image. And it's important for us in Oceania to understand the impact of that picture, okay? If you look at the top left corner, as Phil pointed out, that is Hawaii. That's where I live. Kiribati would be just below in that dotted line area. To the far right, which is not on the screen, but just off of this colorful map here is Mexico, okay? So this is termed the Clarion-Clipperton area. When I saw this map and I realized that this map represents what the global north would like to do in the Pacific to mine it for what we're calling those special metals, polymetallic nodules. I wanted to ask, first of all, why did they have the right to come into our ocean? Because this is our country. We have traversed this for thousands of years with canoes. We have used canoes, the waka, to settle the entirety of Oceania. We know it intimately. We know that our food comes from there. We know the currents and the tides that are related there. We know where the wind comes from, where the rain comes from, and we also know it in 2 hemispheres. Who knows those things except the people of Oceania? That's us. So when you come to this movement that's now, and in my view, is an intrusion. So what helps me to have a position against this, and I think I want to put that out for all of us, where does culture belong in this? So my culture, in terms of my genealogy, my mo'oku auhau, and I'll speak as a Hawaiian because that is my genealogy coming from Hawaii. But I do not discount the fact that the genealogies of all of us in Oceania are the same, okay? But I'll talk from mine. In my genealogy, it says that we derive from the deepest part of the ocean. In the darkest depths of the ocean, there is a place that is called the Vali Vali. It's that sludge, the mud. I like to think it's an organic soup of genetic material. The next line in our genealogy says, there will be created a positive energy called kumulipo as a kane, as a male. And then it says there will be another creation after that that's called Po'ele, the Vahine. This is not man or woman. This is energy. And that energy combines with that organic matter. In the next line says, is created the first living creature on this planet. And that is the Ukuko'akoa, which is the coral polyp. This is my tutu. This is my eldest ancestor who comes from this area of ocean based on my Mo'oku'auhau, our genealogy. If there were ever a place that I think we can find strength, is to go back to our genealogies as the people whose country is the ocean. Let's reclaim our place. But unless we go back to look at our resource, how can we participate in these conversations that are outside of our understanding because it's misplaced? It doesn't belong in here. So I would ask then, what role does our culture play in bringing us together of one voice in this area that is our country, Oceania, to begin now to ask these people in these colored squared areas, you made a law that's called the UNCLOS.
The UN
UNCLOS
law,
stands for?
DSC, UNCLOS.
Yeah. So they made a law that defined this area to be under no one's authority. So they call it a place for the betterment of humankind. And then now they use that law to now find themselves to come into here to say, I'm going to come here to do good for humankind. But they never asked us on the day one that they created this law, the people from the ocean, how would you have contributed to that, to make that law become even better than it is right now? Because would we have allowed this to take precedence and now apply it to us that we haven't even had any voice in? So where do we raise the cultural understanding and the cultural voice that will challenge this picture and say, first of all, you're coming to our country and our home. In our country, it is polite for you to ask permission. Even that is not done. Okay? And then we want to be able to tell you where we come from based on our genealogy. And therefore, we have a direct connection to this ocean, not just where we are created, but where all things are created. And because of that, we are part of this creation of this honua, the earth. And so do we have an interest in that? I would say absolutely we have an interest in that, but we have never been given an opportunity to voice that. So is this a time in which we should be voicing that? And do we have enough of our collective cultural connection, our genealogies, our mokuauhau that give us authority for this country that is ours, the ocean? And if we do, then we should be bringing those voices together as one voice to challenge this and say, you cannot come here. Aole, you don't belong here because this is the place of my creation. So I want to end there.
Thank you, Uncle Sol. Thank you so much. We'll quickly take that last question.
My name's Patricia. I'm from Human Dignity Group, and I'm also a fisheries person. But I wondered, your comment that we did it for nuclear raised my thought. We stopped the nuclear, but we didn't stop New Zealand going back again to Nauru, which they're doing now is to mine again. And we're not stopping in the forests in Solomon Island or Vanuatu because, and why are they harvesting the logs in those beautiful countries is because the countries need the money. In fisheries, every Pacific Island state allows China and Korea and Taiwan and things to come into their EEZs and take the fish. Why do they allow it? You all talk about fish. We belong to the ocean and all these legends and things about fish. but they still like your culture about fish, but the country still let foreign nations come in because the countries need the money. And it's not the UNCLOS, UN Convention on Law at the Sea. That area is called the ABNJ, Area Beyond National Jurisdiction. In other words, the powers in the world believe that no one owns that thing. In the high seas, we normally call it areas beyond national jurisdiction. In other words, no country owns that. That's what they're saying. So I'm not saying I'm against all the comments you've made, which I think are quite valid. But what I'm doing is trying to put it at another level. You can say how culture is important. You can say how it's affecting the environment, the ecology, all sorts of things like that. But at the end of the game, it's the need for money by all these small island states. And it's actually colonialism that they're bringing back on the island states. It's colonialism, and it's very, very hard with that and the need for money to contest that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And I think we'll take that question to the panel. We have response before we end our session. So maybe Langi and then Rufino. Oh, Rufino.
Okay, so my initial reaction is that, yeah, sure. We can't go without talking about the economics of it all, because it all comes down to that. I would say that even for fisheries, they're going to have to face the reality about the issues around DSM, because as our oceans are warming, our tuna stocks are migrating, and eventually they're going to overlap with the areas that will be demarcated for deep sea mining, and then this will be a whole industry conflict. These are uncomfortable conversations that we also need to think about. But I think the way in which it is posed, that we should somehow neglect our heritage and look at it through the commodification of nature and culture as being a central part of the conversation is something that I completely reject and do not entertain.
I'll probably try and respond to both two questions and I think the invitation on where does culture fit in all of this. To a degree, if we were to step away from the boxes that we've been put in to remain in silos in our thinking by design of the system, there is a need for a decolonization conversation on our natural resource, because it's been commodified. It's through and through. We don't have that kind of conversation as a collective, because we come through our different areas of experience or expertise or lived experience. You already have a response. But there are different frameworks that allows us to come together, that the answer is not linear, it's not transactional. There is another element that if you want to put it inside the current broken system is our development and growth model. We need to have a conversation around the trajectory of our development, because this is buried underneath the economics, the machinery of politics, the governance. If we were to lift this up and saying, genuinely, we have a fundamental problem around where you are taking us on your growth ideology. Let's stop that and go back to the drawing board, have a meaningful conversation around the future that we want to see. And I want to preface that also on the ocean, and I'm applying this in the construct of the construct. We have an opportunity. This DSM issue is an opportunity for us to make this a legacy issue on the right side of history. And what I mean by that is the legal mechanism right now provides you that avenue. In the past few decades, 30, 40 years, most of the international rules and regulation around fisheries ocean management, they prioritize extraction. It's extractive in nature. Then they think about conservation. We now are living in an era where we have the conservation of biological diversity. We've the global community committed to 2030. We've got now the new Oceans Treaty, BBNJ, that does provide the opportunity to reverse this norm that we've been socialized to accept, that the business of looking at our resources in the ocean is you exploit it first, then you think about conserving it. We need to reverse that model. And this is one of those chances where we're saying, we don't know enough. We know what the possible impact is. You are trying to drag us through the mud on something else that is potentially detrimental to all the other things that we've been trying to work on. This is that moment in time in history where, irrespective whether you're sitting in the educational sector, health sector, human rights sector, climate change, whatever the boxes we've been put in, this is one of those things we can all rise up together and defend and say no.
Maybe I'll just add to that. FCOSS has done research called A Line in the Sand, and that's on terrestrial mining in Mba and Singatok. Mining extractive just doesn't pay. It affects communities, and that research actually talks about the impacts of mining. In the long run, we pay. We might get some huge investments at the beginning, but in the long run, we are going to have to pay. Do you remember what the coalition government did when they first came in? They promised to pay Vatukola miners, mining community or families of Vatukola miners. That's like 30 years? We're still paying for it as citizens. Mining, any kind of mining, it's not worth it. We're going to pay for the impacts in the long term. So any substantial investments that happen at the beginning, we're going to have to pay back twice as much. I hope that sometime soon we can get some money to do some research on how much exactly we're paying as citizens to pay for the social and environmental impacts of mining. And that's on land mining. Yeah, I just want to emphasize that if you think that we should be conforming to, frames like these, narratives that where we're going to get the money. At the end of the day, as citizens, we're going to have to pay for any repercussions of those impacts, of those mining activities. So I just reject that kind of thinking.
Binakam, Vani, and with that, I'll call this panel to an end. Thank you very much, Rufino. Phil, thank you so much for joining us. Vani, thank you for providing the national perspectives of the national civil societies. And of course, Langi, thank you for pushing boundaries, challenging the narratives, and bringing this discussion, representing the perspectives of Pacific civil society and non-state actors. I'd like to really just thank our panel for driving this discussion to challenging the development framework in the region, and as we as Pacific people, challenging the narrative put on us, and what is our narrative, and asserting our right as Pacific people for protection. Obviously, there is need for more discussions like this, not only within civil society, non-state actors, but it's a challenge to other institutions beyond the formal spaces of where our Pacific governments or leaders, political forums convene. There are need for more discussions within not only the civil society, faith-based organization, academia, private sector. We all have a stake in the ocean, and it is rightfully our large ocean home. With that, thank you very much. I'll hand it back to our master of ceremony, but really want to thank the Center for Sustainable Futures here at the Marine Campus. Thank you very much to the University of the South Pacific for hosting us. Vinaka.
Thank you, Choi. Thank you, the panel, for a very interesting discussion. Can you please have a round for the wonderful panel we have here, and for the wonderful discussions that have ensued because of your attention to this matter, and the questions that you've posed, which have brought about more thoughtful insights into this very important topic for the region. I will now defer to Lyser for the vote of thanks. And if you could all have a picture out in the front at the end, that'll be great. Thank you.
So on behalf of the organizers of this evening, the Pacific Network on Globalization, Pacific Blue Line, and of course USP and Greenpeace, we would like to extend our sincerest thank you, Vinaka Vakalevu, for making time to be part of this very, very important discussion. If anything is clear from this evening is that there's not enough time to discuss deep sea mining. 2 hours is not enough. But please join us again tomorrow at FNU for more discussion and join our Pacific leaders. But also, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Before we disperse, we have just a little spread in the back there. Please join us in enjoying the spread. And continue this discussion. As we've heard from our panelists and also everybody here today, is that we can't keep working in silos. We need to work together, and that means more Talanoa, more discussion. That's the only way that we can continue this work.